War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Those are the words that repeat again and again throughout Orwell's legendary 1984. The book is not just about massive government control by Big Brother over the citizenry, but it is also about how such control is enabled by the abuse of language. You can always smell a rat when words are used to mean something other than what they say.
Almost just like the word ego. Now, if you were to look up the concept of id, then you would know what I mean.
And this bill is filled with such false words. Let's start with the very premise. Government purports to apply the internet to the Broadcasting Act, or the Broadcasting Act to the internet, even though the internet is not a broadcast instrument. Exactly. Television and radio are broadcast instruments. Online streaming is not. Now, this might seem to be merely a matter of words, but then you go through the semantics and you catch other nice white little lies. For example, they use the term in their talking points, in their press releases, Canadian content. Supposedly, the entire raison d'etre of this bill, its reason for existing, is to promote Canadian content. Which two words appear nowhere in the 50-page bill itself?
He'll ask the same question, but what is Canadian content? If not a Canadian making this video right now about a Canadian talking about Canadian freedom. Like, what is not Canadian about that?
Canadian content. Not only is such content not defined, it's impossible to define it, but it doesn't exist in the entire bill. So here we have an entire apparatus, a bureaucracy that will have tentacles across the entire World Wide Web within Canadian borders, tasked to do something that the bill says doesn't even exist. And why is this important? Because if the bureaucracy in question has its powers circumscribed to defining and promoting Canadian content, but there is no limit on what Canadian content actually means, then we give that agency limitless powers to control what people see and hear online. What is Canadian content? Is it posts about maple syrup, beaver tails, hockey, maybe lacrosse? Nope, that's not in the Act. Is it music made by Canadian musicians? Nope, not necessarily. In fact, many Canadian musicians are no longer considered Canadian because their record labels have been sold to foreign entertainment companies. Is it books? They're written by Canadians. No, that is not the definition either. We have absolutely no idea what it is. In fact, we can be very sure what it is not. For example, and this will send my opposition, they will be in the opposition soon, my friends across the way into a fit of rage. But obviously, the Canadian commentator who is most widely viewed and listened to around the world today is, of course, Dr. Jordan Peterson. That is just a numerical fact when you look at the view counts that he has garnered. But I see the rage across the way among those who think he is anything but Canadian. He was born in rural Alberta. Sure, he was a professor at the University of Toronto before he was censored there. But he surely can't be Canadian. He doesn't use the right pronouns. He doesn't mouth the right talking points. He does not meet this government's view of Canadiana. This Prime Minister has described people who disagree with him as un-Canadian. Surely, the bureaucracy which he points would have to agree.
See, that's a good point, because technically, as it stands, I'm not Canadian. Neither is Pierre. Neither is anybody that is on the opposition Canadian to the Prime Minister. That's not right. That's dictatorship. Just because you don't agree with what I agree with or what I stand for doesn't mean that I'm not Canadian.
And if the Association of Psychologists that gives out licenses to practice in Ontario doesn't believe that his views permit him to continue practicing in his field, and if a university is effectively banning him from teaching in his classes, what would stop yet another powerful bureaucracy from saying this man is not Canadian enough to be considered Canadian content and therefore should not be found online by Canadian users?
Sorry for interrupting, but that's another good point. Now, that teacher wouldn't just not be found on the internet. That teacher would be fired and never be able to have a job again if we had that sort of authoritarian dictatorship in the government.
The answer, of course, nothing would stop that from happening when you give the power to the state to control what people see and say online. But the government across the way will say, don't worry. The bill does not apply to user-generated content. Once again, with the fancy, confusing words. User-generated content is stuff you post online, right? To use real language, right? They say it doesn't apply to that, unless it does. Let me just read the section of the Act. Specify that the Act does not apply in respect of programs uploaded online on online undertaking that provides social media services by a user of the service unless the programs are prescribed by regulation.
Unless the programs are prescribed by regulation.
So, unless, make sure to read the fine print. Later on, they specifically exempt user-generated content. This is the stuff that everyday Canadians post every day. They say that it doesn't apply to any of that, unless it's posted on a platform that uses it for revenue generation. Is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, are they in the charity business? Or do they generate revenue off of the posts that go online? Those things called advertising, that's revenue. Literally every single post that every single Canadian puts online is used to generate revenue for an online platform. Therefore, everything that is posted online is captured by the essence of this Act. More weasel words. If they were going to regulate everything that everybody posted online, and they believed they were justified in doing so, why would they create an exemption that doesn't apply to a single solitary post? Well, of course, it once again is a use of newspeak, of putting in words that say exactly the opposite of what they mean. I want to quote from Michael Geist, no conservative, a former critic of mine, actually, not traditionally a friend of people on this side of the chamber, who said, to be clear, the risk with these rules is not that the government will restrict the ability of Canadians to speak, but rather that the bill could impact their ability to be heard. In other words, the CRTC will not be positioned to stop Canadians from posting content, but will have the power to establish regulations that could prioritize or deprioritize certain content, mandate warning labels, and establish other conditions with the presentation of the content, including algorithmic outcomes. The government has insisted that the bill isn't the goal of the bill, and if so, the solution is obvious. No other country in the world seeks to regulate user content in this way, and it should be removed from the bill because it does not belong in the Broadcasting Act, end quote.
See, even the people that are the Conservatives' enemies don't want this bill to be passed. Doesn't that say something?
If they did not intend to deprioritize, to silence, to push down the voices of some, why would they even include these provisions in the bill in the first place? Well, the answer is they want to regulate what can be heard and seen. They want to create the false perception that people can speak merely because they can post the things online, but frankly, there's no reason posting something if no one is allowed to see it. It would be like screaming into an empty forest, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, the fact that this government gives the power to a state regulator to alter the algorithms of the internet is frankly terrifying. Who are the shady operators in the back room that will be manipulating the algorithms that bring our news feeds and our social media posts onto our screens? What are their motives? What are their direction? None of these things are defined anywhere in the bill or by the testimony of the head of the government agency that is charged with implementing them. Altering algorithms in a world where we are already overly controlled by technology. You know, think of the devastating power of artificial intelligence. We know because on that side there's plenty of artificial intelligence. But I digress.
Not good artificial intelligence.
It's definitely artificial, Mr. Speaker. But in reality, the ability of a government bureaucracy to alter those algorithmic powers is an enormous and unforgiving power indeed. And if I can quote Orwell, the process of continuous alteration was applied not only to the newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, films, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs, to every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance, end quote. That is exactly what we're talking about here because algorithms determine everything that appears on our devices. It is mathematical programming that puts those things in front of our eyeballs. Right now, that programming is determined by a raw human emotion, greed. There's no doubt about it. The social media platforms want to make money. How do they do it? They give people stuff they want to see. You might take issue with the fact that they want to make money off that, but that's just the reality. The outcome is that we see what we want. Now, what's motivating this bill, the economic motivation, is also greed. It's the greed of the broadcasting corporations who want to dominate eyeballs, but instead of dominating them by producing things people want to see, they'll dominate them by having more power over the regulator that determines what people get. And that too is motivated by greed. Now, both of these profit motives are going to exist. One in the free world, where people choose for themselves, and another in the coercive world, where bureaucrats choose for them. But do not ascribe any angelic motives to this bill. This bill is nothing more than a dirty alliance between big government and big corporations. Big government that wants to control the citizenry, and big broadcasting and entertainment corporations that want to control the advertising revenue. And that is precisely why Bell and Rogers and all the other broadcasting corporations have come pleading for this bill to be put forward and advanced on their behalf, not on behalf of everyday people. So here's the decision. Do we want the content on our phones and our screens to be determined by the click or by the clique? This bill proposes to have it done by the clique. And all the brilliant artists whose parents are not rich enough to have agents that will promote them with news and entertainment bodies and corporations, they will be shut out. It'll be the rich kids whose parents dream of them being famous, who will be able to go to these entertainment companies, who have had the ability over the years to get record labels set up. Those rich kids always had a head start, but it will be the poor kids who learn how to play the piano in their basement and would otherwise have posted it online and gone viral. They will be shut out because they will not have the political influence in Ottawa, in the CRTC, to get themselves on the big screen. And so this is once again protecting the privilege behind a wall of gatekeepers. Madam Speaker, we on this side of the House believe in a meritocracy, not an aristocracy. We believe everybody should get ahead by their own merits, and we believe that Canadians are intelligent enough to to decide for themselves. And let me address finally one other issue about the social media platforms. The government claims it wants to crack down on them because they're making too much money. This bill will not affect their profit or their bottom line by 1 penny. This bill proposes to keep all the content we see on those same social media platforms. Our broadcasters don't compete with social media platforms. They compete with other Canadians who are fighting for share of voice and share of eyeball. What this will actually do is simply take money and opportunity away from the individual citizen to have his or her voice heard in entertainment, in news, in discourse, and everywhere else, and concentrate it once again in the hands of the politically powerful and the well-connected and those that can find favor with this government. We, in this side of the House of Commons, exist to decentralize power, to disperse it amongst the many, instead of concentrating it in the hands of the few. And that is why we rise today with such alarm that the Prime Minister would censor debate on a censorship bill. I don't know if in the century and a half of this august chamber it has ever happened that a government has censored debate on a censorship bill. It is an appalling precedent, and one that should concern every free-thinking Canadian citizen. We inherit our rights not from the state, not from a powerful government bureaucracy. We inherit those as a gift from God. Freedom is written on every human heart. We all have the ability to express ourselves culturally, politically, and in every other way, not because the Prime Minister has bestowed us with that right, but because we are born with that right, and Conservatives will make sure people have that right once again. This is a bill that is designed to take away that right and to concentrate it in the hands of the few. And do not take my word for it. Listen to Margaret Atwood. Again, no friend of conservatism. And she said, all you have to do is read some of the biographies of the writers writing in the Soviet Union and the degrees of censorship they had to go through. Government bureaucrats. So it is creeping totalitarianism if governments are telling creators what to create, end quote. Those are her words, creeping totalitarianism. If anyone else in Canada had used those terms, they would have been called alarmist. But someone who is part of the literary establishment in this country, possibly among the most well-known, someone with whom I agree on almost nothing, because our views are not at all aligned, but she understands one thing, and that is that the power of words can only exist in concert with the freedom to express those words. I'm sure that she would vigorously debate most of the things that I say on the floor of the House of Commons, but that's only possible if you have freedom to debate. Disagreement is the lifeblood of democracy. It is the worst system of government, except for all the others, in the words of the great Winston Churchill. It is messy. It is frustrating. It is arduous in every day and every way. It would be much easier to have, as the Prime Minister has suggested, a basic Chinese communist dictatorship where a powerful hand can decide at a whim. That was the reason why he admired. He said that they decide on the spot what to do and they impose their decisions without any debate. That would be a lot easier in the short run. You know, oftentimes we're told there's too much partisanship and disagreement in Canada. There are places in the world with no partisanship and no disagreement. And Madam Speaker, they are terrible places to live. I would rather live in a place where we're allowed to disagree, where we're allowed to speak out. That is who we are as Canadians. And the question is, who decides? Do we allow a small group of privileged insiders close to the Prime Minister decide what we think, say, and believe, or do we believe that every single Canadian is endowed by God with the ability to decide for themselves? Madam Speaker, I believe every Canadian has that ability, and that is why we will stand up every day, in every way, for the Section 2B rights of freedom of expression. That is who we are. That is what we believe. It is the common sense of the common people united for our home. Your home, my home, our home, Canada. Let's bring it